Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks to all of you for joining us. It's fabulous to see such an extraordinary crowd here in the Dole Institute. We at our absolute max allowed by the fire marshal, and I'm sorry that we had to turn some folks away. A number of people, by the way, have asked, why didn't you do this event at the Lead Center? It's very simple. We invite speakers. We do not pay them honoraria. We say to them, if you can come on a particular date, we will build an event around you. And this was an opportunity to have Speaker Gingrich here tonight, and the Lead Center and no other appropriate venue was available. We're delighted we could do it here, but we do wish we had a little bit more capacity. We at the Dole Institute take our mission to emphasize the importance of politics in a bipartisan way very seriously. We're proud of having hosted progressives like George McGovern, former Vice President Walter Mondale, former Senator Carol Moseley Braun, and our current Vice President, when he was Senator, Joe Biden. And we've hosted conservatives like George H.W. Bush, Howard Baker, and Bob Dole. Tonight we host another very prominent conservative leader. Newt Gingrich is without a doubt the best thinker in the Republican Party today. His view that the GOP should focus on applying... Thank you. I don't usually get applause during the introduction, so I'll pay my writer a tip tonight. His view that the GOP should focus on applying conservative principles to today's problems and serve as an alternative party rather than an opposition party highlights his commitment to the notion that ideas have consequences and that a political party without ideas is one doomed to failure. Speaker Gingrich has also authored 19 books, received his Ph.D. from Tulane University, and taught at the University of West Georgia before being elected to Congress in 1978. I first learned about our guest in 1982 when I worked for last fall's Dole Fellow, Joe Gaylord, who helped us secure the speaker's visit today. Joe, where are you? Joe Gaylord? Everybody, a round of applause for Joe. Step out. Thank you very much, Joe. We just wanted to thank you so much for, okay, now you can use that as an excuse to go across. So, Joe and I worked for Congressman Guy Vanderjagt at the National Republican Congressional Committee, and Congressman Vanderjagt was one of the early GOP leaders who helped build the party long before the 1994 Republican Revolution. Vanderjagt recruited GOP candidates and had a great eye for talent, which he clearly saw in Newt Gingrich. Speaker Gingrich is well known as the architect of the contract with America that led the Republican Party to victory in 1994. After being elected the first Republican Speaker of the House in 40 years, he disrupted the status quo by moving power out of Washington and back to the American people. Under his leadership, Congress passed welfare reform, passed the first balanced budget in a generation, and passed the first tax cut in 16 years. Time magazine named him Man of the Year in 1995 and said this, "Leaders make things possible. Exceptional leaders make them inevitable. Newt Gingrich belongs in the category of the exceptional." Please join me in welcoming our first Robert J. Dole Distinguished Visiting Fellow, Speaker Newt Gingrich.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, all of you, for coming out this evening. And I'm delighted to have this kind of a turnout, and I realize it is partially a sign that the World Series is not quite as important as a basketball game, and therefore the competition wasn't as bad as it could have been, but I'm still delighted to be here, and I'm glad to be here on behalf of the Dole Institute because I worked with Bob Dole for many, many years. And so it's a great honor for me to be allowed to come here and to be with Bill Lacey. And I'm delighted with the job that Bill is doing. Although I have to confess, when they designed my visit today, part of it was exactly what I like to do because we went to your extraordinary Natural History Museum, which if you have not been to it recently, I really recommend you go to it because it may be the best university natural history museum in the United States, and it's an extraordinary facility. And I think I just had a tremendously fun time relaxing and looking at fossils and paleontology and talking to graduate students and staff and talking about big ideas. And then we left the paleontology collection and we went across to politics and pizza, and that was fun. And it's a student gathering where the students come in and they get part of something the Dole Institute does with visiting people, and you get to chat with the students directly and answer questions and have a real dialogue. And then I went to this truly bizarre course on conspiracies and paranoia. Now, I just want to report to all of you, if you've come from Washington to the heartland, you do not need to spend part of your day on conspiracies and paranoia. I mean, you've just left the city, which is the largest single generator of conspiracies and paranoia in America. But we had a great time with the students, and it was really a very interesting class, and the students were very engaged. And as a former history teacher, it was a great chance to talk with them, so I really enjoyed it. But I've now gotten into a conversation which I can't get out of. It's like one of those closed loops where some of you I'm sure have gotten into this, where you have something and you can't figure out how to solve it. So I need a little help, and I'm hoping that somewhere, either in this room or in the other room, we have a genuine, serious student of KU history. Now, let me say his background, by the way, that I'm glad to be back because when I was a young kid, I spent 3 years at Fort Riley with my father, and so I had a fair amount of time growing up in Kansas, and then my dad came back and served at Leavenworth at the Command and Staff College, and for a number of years I would come back out and teach at the Command and Staff College, so I'm thrilled to have a chance to come back and be with you. I also want to say that I'm very thrilled, I'm not sure where she's sitting, but former Congresswoman Jan Myers is here. And Jan, I wish you, there you are, stand up and take a bow. Jan is an example of America at its best, because when we were in the middle of trying to think through welfare reform, which was the most successful conservative reform in the last 70 years, 65% of the people on welfare either went to work or went to school. It was an extraordinary achievement. When we were trying to think it through and develop it, Jan was adamant that in her experience as a state legislator, she was convinced you could not marginally change it, that you had to fundamentally rethink it from the ground up. And because of her tenacity and her willingness to get into really intense arguments, we ended up ultimately bringing in Governor Leavitt and Governor Thompson and Governor Engler and their staffs. And for one of the very few times in history, we actually had the governor's state-level staffs in the room with the various congressional staffs jointly writing the bill to make sure that it was practical, that it was implementable, and that it would really work. And Jan deserves a great deal of credit for the most successful single reform. I also have to say I can't come to Kansas without commenting on a couple of other people I've worked with. I don't know of any member of Congress who showed more consistent courage than Pat Roberts when he worked with me through the Contract with America and the entire process of agricultural reform. And he works so hard, and he personifies a Marine Corps tradition of always being faithful, of courageously doing what he thinks is right. And I know from experience over the years, both because my wife used to work for him and several of our very dear friends, Jackie Cottrell, for example, works for him right now. And Pat literally balances service to Kansas and service to the nation with as much intensity as anybody I know. And if you see him, you ought to say thank you for the quality of service that he gives the state. It's a remarkable guy. I also want to say that I'm honored to have served with Sam Brownback, and without getting in any way partisan or in any way political, the fact that he may someday have governor in front of his name strikes me as a good thing, but that's a personal observation in passing and should not be taken in any way as a political comment. Nor will the fact that I have to report to you that Jerry Moran called me last night, and that, as you know, he's fairly busily engaged in crisscrossing the state, and we had a great conversation, and my wife also worked with Jerry for a while. And again, I'm a good friend of Todd Tiart's. I am not getting into primaries. I just want you to know that you have a good delegation of hardworking people who care deeply about this state and care deeply about the country. And that's something you can be very proud of. Now, I want to go back to my problem. So we were this afternoon, I have several people with me, Christina Martin, who's over here somewhere, Steve Everly, who are graduates of KU and have the appropriate level of passion, fanaticism, intense belief, living the dream. And so we were working our way through Rock, Chalk, Jayhawk, and we were trying to make sure that I could learn this. But I'm a historian, so I first of all want to know, as somebody who used to live in the state, when did it replace Raw, Jayhawk, Raw? And it turned out it was 1897, which really is helpful. And at some point down the road, if I'm somewhere in the state talking to a Rotary Club, I will use that as a sign that I know something about Kansas history that matters, as opposed to, say, the struggle at the beginning of the Civil War, all that stuff people usually talk about. But then one of them, Steve says in passing, because he's a very good student, I think he's an honors graduate and he knows a fair amount, that Theodore Roosevelt once said that Rock, Chalk, Jayhawk was the best chant of any college in America. Now, you don't always get applause for Teddy with those kind of quotes, but I thought I'd try to help him out a little bit here. But I then, because some of the folks who work with me forget occasionally that I actually, once upon a time, got a PhD in history, and I actually occasionally used to teach history. So I said innocently, so when did Theodore Roosevelt say this? And why did he say it? Now, I want to report to you, without in any way embarrassing Steve, that for 2 hours he's been unable to find the answer. So I'm just putting it out here. If any of you over the next few days find somebody who knows when Theodore Roosevelt said this and why he said it, if you'll let Bill Lacey know, he will get me the information so that some afternoon when I'm on television and we're doing an interview of some kind, I can drop it. It's the sort of thing that makes people think you really know a lot, because it's inconceivable that anybody would know it. And so, I would like your help at that point, and then I can say, well, when you think of a great college chant like Rock, Chalk, Jayhawk, and you think about Theodore Roosevelt talking about it as the best chant in the country, at which point, by the way, Sean Hannity's eyes will glaze over totally. He will have no idea why I'm doing it. But everybody in this room will know where it started. So what I'm going to do for a couple minutes is outline a way of thinking about the future, and then just toss it open and we'll have a conversation. I like coming to academic settings because I think we actually need a very serious conversation about America's future. And I think we need a conversation which transcends negative advertising, 30-second commercials, flippant press conferences, debates on television, and gets into a serious underlying dialogue where people, over a period of time, really ask, what are we doing and how are we going to solve it? And I think the combination of having the current economic problems, having challenges that run from Gaza to South Lebanon to Iraq to Iran to Afghanistan to Pakistan to India to South Thailand to Indonesia to the Philippines to North Korea to recently arrests in Denver, Detroit, and New York for terrorists, and the fact that we have a very radical regime in the White House and in the Congress which are trying to pass very, very large-scale change as rapidly as they can and with as little public involvement as they can. That whole combination of things, I think, has led the American people to a greater willingness to have a fundamental conversation than we've had in a long time. And I think in that sense, we may be at the edge of one of the great learning periods that really get us to come together as a country. It was very interesting. if you look at the election results last night, which suddenly became very decisive the last weekend, with the Republican Bob McDonnell winning the governor's race in Virginia by 59 to 41, which is the largest margin for a Republican in history, and a swing of about 25 points from where Obama was 1 year ago. And looking at Chris Christie winning the governor's race in New Jersey by 4 times the margin that Christie Whitman won it by in 1993, the last time we're in this kind of a setting. And doing so despite the fact that the incumbent governor had spent over $24 million of the money he'd earned at Goldman Sachs to try to buy the seat again. He outspent Christie by 4 to 1. But what you saw happen is people were engaged in a dialogue for months. And then suddenly it got time to make a decision, and you could see them close up, and you could see them think it through, and suddenly both states began to clarify themselves. And I think for the country, we need that kind of conversation, and I think we're actually ready to have it. I think there are 3 large questions that are going to fundamentally decide the future of America. The first is, who are we? The second is, how do you create prosperity while competing with China and India? And the third is, who wants to hurt us, and how do we keep America and our allies safe? I think those 3 questions are so fundamental to our future that you have to start there, because how you answer those 3 actually tells you a whole range of secondary answers. And we tend to be down here in the weeds. We tend to be arguing over this bill or that bill, this amendment or that amendment. But what really matters is actually up here. It's a fundamental vision of the values that define us and the things we're trying to achieve. So let me walk you through those 3 for a couple minutes. The most important question is, who are we? My daughter Jackie Cushman writes a column, and a couple weeks ago she wrote, "We thought we were voting for change you could believe in, and discovered we were voting for someone who wanted to change what we believe." And I thought that was actually a very profound insight. Now let me share with you why. We just wrote a new novel called To Try Men's Souls, which is about the American Revolution and about George Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas Day, 1776, in a snowstorm with ice in the river and with 1/3 of his army without boots, having wrapped their feet in burlap bags, so they literally would march on an icy road for 9 miles to Trenton, leaving a trail of blood behind. And in studying and researching and developing that novel, and in looking at the Founding Fathers, what really comes through is they actually meant the Declaration of Independence. And I think we don't teach this enough in our schools. We don't talk about this enough. The Declaration of Independence is a political document. And yet it says, we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now I want you to think about this at 2 levels. First of all, we are the only society in history that says power comes from God to each one of you personally. You are personally sovereign, and then you loan power to the government, which is why we begin our Constitution, we, the people of the United States. Not the lawyers, not the bureaucrats, not the politicians, not the judges. Power resides in America in the sovereignty of the people. And Jefferson was fanatic about this, which is why we get the 10 amendments that define our rights. Well, that's a very big decision. And yet many of our modern schools won't even teach our kids what the words mean. How do you go in a modern school and say, let me explain why the Founding Fathers wrote, we are endowed by our Creator? And then you'd have to suggest what the word Creator meant. And the ACLU would sue you. So you're not allowed to teach accurately the history of the United States, and then you wonder why kids don't know the history of the United States. And then you wonder why we're losing our rights, when in fact we have no basis for defending our rights anymore. If all we are is randomly gathered protoplasm who could have been rhinoceroses but got lucky, then there's no protection against the state. Then we are creatures of the state. It's the whole point of Orwell's 1984. But there's a second part to this that makes it so central. We are endowed with the right to pursue happiness. And this was a Scottish Enlightenment term that meant wisdom and virtue. It did not mean hedonism. It did not mean acquisition. And we know this because Jefferson owned a copy of the Scottish philosopher who wrote it, and Jefferson had underlined the phrase in his book. It's in the Library of Congress. But notice what it says. Pursue. Well, there's a fundamental choice here. Pursue implies you've been endowed by God with rights, but by the way, you have some obligations. You have to have the work ethic. You have to be prepared to pursue. You have to be willing to learn. To not do so is to deny God's endowment. I mean, think about it, pretty heavy stuff. I mean, these people were not playing games. Notice the other implication. To pursue, not an entitlement. No place does it say you're entitled to be happy. No place does it say you have a right to litigate if you're unhappy. No place does it say we need a federal Department of Happiness. We should issue happiness stamps for the unhappy. We need to redistribute happiness because the happiest people are unfairly happy and the unhappiest people are being cheated. This cultural question of who are we is central to everything else that follows. I personally believe the most important single political slogan of the next 20 years is the phrase 2 + 2 = 4. I know it's bold. It's out on the edge. A couple of you are leaning over saying, exactly what does that mean? But let me tell you why. When the Polish people began rebelling after Pope John Paul II's 9-day visit in 1979, which we've gotten into because Clifton and I are making a movie about it called 9 Days That Changed the World, they really began to rise against the Soviet state. And they began printing posters that said 2 + 2 = 4. And they would say to each other, if the state tells you Poland doesn't have a history, they're lying. If the state tells you we don't have the right to erect a cross, they're lying. If the state tells you we're not allowed to work and keep our earnings, they're lying. And part of it came out of Orwell, who in 1984 has the torturer saying to the innocent citizen who he's torturing, if we tell you 2 + 2 = 15, it equals 15. And if we tell you 2 + 2 = 3, it equals 3 because we're the state and you should believe us. And the citizen's thinking, but what if it equals 4? Camus wrote in The Plague, there are times when a man can be killed for saying 2 + 2 = 4 because the authorities can't stand the truth. I think captures the crisis we're in. Let me give you an American example so you'll understand why I think this cultural question is at the heart of our current problem. I'm going to give you half of an equation that fits America, and I want to see if you all can come up with the other half. If you can't afford to buy a house, don't buy it, rent. How many of you would generally agree, if you can't afford to buy a house, don't buy it? I'm serious. Raise your hand if you agree, if you can't afford to buy a house, don't buy it. It's very important. Because think about what you just said to me. For 25 years, we've been lying. For 25 years, we've said to people, if you can't afford to buy a house, I'm going to get you in one with no down payment, no credit. You don't have to pay any principal for 3 years. I'm going to give you a below prime interest rate. And guess what happens? They can't afford to buy a house. So they go broke. Now, if it happens to one person, it's a personal tragedy. If it happens to 1 million people, it's a national crisis. Yet have you heard anybody in national authority in either party suggest to you that maybe the core problem is cultural, not economic, not financial, not political? Now let me carry a step further. I'm going to give you another example. If you don't learn, you shouldn't get a diploma. Every time we give a student a diploma they didn't earn, we cheat them for life. We totally mislead them. You can go through 20 things. You can't fix the health system unless you recenter responsibility in individuals. Because you can't deal with diabetes, asthma, arthritis, and cardiovascular disease unless the individual's engaged. You can't get women for breast cancer diagnostics unless they want to. So now you have to have a whole different, it's not a question about financing. It's a question about the whole nature of the health system. Which is why the current bills are so ludicrous. They try to shift around who pays for a system that's broken, rather than trying to seriously think through fixing the system. So this whole question of who are we, how honest can we be? You know, don't tell me we're going to have transparency and pass a $787 billion bill that no one has read. I mean, it's just blatantly, it's an insult to the intelligence of every American. But if we're going to slow down, and we're going to actually have all the bills printed, and we're actually all going to be engaged in knowing what's going on, and we're all going to have to actually be responsible, and we're actually going to have to study and learn, and we're actually going to have to save enough to buy a house because we actually earned it, this will be a different country. And there'll be some very wrenching changes in that process. And that's a big decision. But it's the core decision. We either become a country endowed by its creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or we become a secular socialist European state with a big government and small people. Over here you have responsible people and a limited government. Not a weak government, a limited government. Over here you have a huge government that's incompetent and bureaucratic and tiny people who are told what to do. This is the core decision of America's future. Everything else follows it. Second, how do we compete with China and India? And let me be very clear here. China and India are not a problem. China and India are a fact. What we do about it is a problem. There are 1,300,000,000 Chinese who have every right to pursue happiness. There are 1 billion Indians who have every right to pursue happiness. They're all rolling up their sleeves and they all want to come play. And for the first time in about 170 years, we're going to have real competitors of our scale. And we're going to have to roll up our sleeves and decide to play. The best single description of this is a movie called 2 Million Minutes, which I recommend to all of you. You can get it at 2mminutes.com. And it's a brilliant film. 2 Million Minutes is 4 years of high school. And it shows you 2 Indians, 2 Chinese, and 2 Americans in 4 years of high school. And at the end of the movie, you realize that we are a country aggressively preparing for the 1956 Olympics. And we're not going to win any medals in 2012, preparing for the 1956 Olympics. And so it really challenges you to think about the scale of change we need. In our judgment, we created American solutions around a very simple model. I have 2 grandchildren. Maggie's 10 and Robert's 8. My deepest goal is for them in their 40s and 50s to be safe, prosperous, and free. To do that, I believe, they have to be in the most productive, most creative society in the world, because only by being the most productive and most creative society can we sustain our standard of living and sustain our national security system. Now, I believe to do that, if you really are honest and you really benchmark your competitors and you really say what's it going to take, I believe that it requires us to fundamentally rethink litigation, regulation, taxation, education, health, energy, and infrastructure. And I think you've got to do all 7 of them. And that's going to be a huge fight and a huge challenge. But let me just give you a couple quick examples. I wrote 2 novels about World War II, Pearl Harbor and Days of Infamy. From December 7th, 1941 to victory over Japan in August of 1945 is 44 months. Think about that. 3 years and 8 months. We mobilized 15.5 million people in uniform. We build the B-24, B-29, B-17. We build a two-ocean navy. We build 4 cities and 29 facilities for the atomic bomb. We put up the Pentagon in 18 months. We sweep across North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Luxembourg, Holland, Belgium, conquer Germany while simultaneously sweeping across the Pacific. We do all that in 44 months. It recently took 23 years to add a 5th runway to the Atlanta airport. It's absurd. 8 years after 9/11, we still have not rebuilt the World Trade Center. In World War II, we would have rebuilt it in 18 months using exactly the same plans to build exactly the same buildings to say to our enemies, you cannot knock us down, we're back. Just think about the difference. And so that requires very fundamental rethinking about who we are and what we're doing. Finally, national security. We are in substantial danger. And we're in substantial danger because we refuse to be honest about how complicated and how hard this is going to be. One of the reasons that Bill Fortune and Steve Hanser and I decided to write To Try Men's Souls was we were sitting around a year and a half ago and we said, you know, people are going to be worried about the economy. They're going to be worried about foreign dangers. They're going to be worried about the Congress and the White House. And they need to have an example of America when our back was to the wall and we did what it took. And that particular day, Christmas Day, 1776, is one of the most extraordinary and one of the most heroic in American history. But it had to start with honesty. Washington had been beaten all fall. He had 30,000 men in Brooklyn. They were almost wiped out by the British, and they only got across the East River because a huge fog came in, and they literally, the Royal Navy, which was sitting to block them, couldn't see them. And so they literally had rowboats and were able to get across the river. 30,000 men. Washington said it was a miracle. They're then driven from Manhattan. They're driven from White Plains. They're driven from Palisades. They suffer 2 humiliating defeats where thousands of men surrender. They're driven across New Jersey. By mid-December, they've shrunk from 30,000 to 2,500. And as I said earlier, 1/3 of the 2,500 don't have boots. Now Washington, who is as sophisticated a student of democracy, freedom, and leadership as anybody we've ever had, understood that for a free society to succeed, you have to marry the pen and the sword. And we had a great pamphleteer, Thomas Paine, who had written Common Sense, which was the best description of the Declaration of Independence, widely read, very popular. And Paine was serving as a rifleman. And Washington went to him and said, I don't need you as a rifleman. I need you to write another pamphlet. Because we're all depressed and we're all worried. And someone has to explain to us, why are we doing this? Why are we going through this? Paine agonizes for a couple months, can't quite figure it out. Finally, has the inspiration, goes to Philadelphia. And it begins. These are the times that try men's souls. And he talks about the sunshine patriot and the summer soldier. And he talks about being down to the last hardcore. Remember, less than 1 out of every 1,000 Americans is still with Washington at Christmas. Less than 1 out of every 1,000. And he explains that victory over tyranny, like victory over hell, is hard bought. That the fight will be difficult. The opening couple paragraphs are magnificent, and we reprint the opening chapter at the back of our novel. Washington thought so highly of it that when the men were boarding the boats that night, remember, they're going to do a night crossing of a river with ice in the middle of a snowstorm in order to march 9 miles at night on an icy, unpaved road, in order to surprise a professional German unit, which they are going to force to surrender so they can win a decisive victory. I mean, this is pretty daring stuff. And as they get aboard the boats, Washington has the officers read to them from Paine's new pamphlet. Because Washington understands that a free people has to understand what they're doing. They have enormous courage once they understand it's right and once they understand it's unavoidable. Now, I'm sharing that with you because we are now in, arguably, the 30th year of a difficult struggle. At a minimum, we're in the 8th year, but I think that's fundamentally the wrong way to think of it. There's a book called Guest of the Ayatollah by Mark Bowden, who wrote Black Hawk Down. Bowden's a great reporter, and where Black Hawk Down became a movie about Somalia, and he actually went to Somalia to interview Somalis. Guest of the Ayatollah is about the Iranians taking over the American embassy in 1979, which was totally illegal, fundamentally against international law. And they held hostages for 444 days, which was totally illegal. The subtitle of Bowden's book is Iran's First Shots in the War Against America. And Bowden would argue that the 1983 killing of the Marines in Baghdad, the bombing at Khobar Towers, the bombing of the 2 embassies in East Africa, the bombing in New York and Washington, and the downing of the airplane near Pittsburgh, that this is all a continuum. And it's a continuum which, as I said, we recently arrested people in Denver, Detroit, and New York. And yet we can't even talk honestly about this. We don't have a Thomas Paine, because a Thomas Paine who wrote The Truth would be so politically correct we'd immediately drive him out of public life. So ask yourself, what's the one common characteristic of the people we just picked up in New York, Detroit, and Denver? You list all their characteristics. What's the one common characteristic? They're not Arabs. Several of them are native born. They're all Muslims, and they're all committed to destroying the United States. And they all know this. They're not confused. What are the 2 leading centers of paying people to learn how to destroy the United States? Saudi Arabia, which funds the Sunni version, and Iran, which funds the Shia version. How explicit is that? 100%. There's no question. I mean, no rational, serious student doubts that. So what's our strategy? We have a national energy policy which is bowing to the Saudi king. Utterly irrational. I mean, a great country 30 years into a conflict like this ought to have a totally energy-free policy where we produced enough American energy that we laughed at them and we ignored them. We don't, because we can't even talk about it as a country. We would be aware of the fact that we actually have 2 fundamentally different threats facing us. We have a very real threat of an immediate danger from people who want to destroy us. And we have the long-term threat of Chinese civilization gradually building such momentum in science and technology that we're not competitive, that we lose all the advantages we've had for the last 170 years. So the Chinese threat requires us to rethink our own education system, our industrial base, our tax policy, to recognize that if we don't rebuild our capacity to compete, we will not be the leading country in the world. You can't have a competitor with $2 trillion of your bonds. I mean, let's go back to 2 + 2 = 4. Who do you think has greater impact right now? The Chinese central bank or the Federal Reserve? I mean, if the Chinese came over Tuesday and said, we'd like to cash in our $2 trillion, we're tired of, the dollar would collapse that day and interest rates would go to 30%. Well, this is the scale we've got to think about. Now, so we need a national conversation. Could we at least be honest about who our opponents are? And here's where we're trapped, and this is why I'm having this conversation tonight with you and why I'm grateful to the Dole Institute for letting me come here. We're in a setting where we're arguing over Afghanistan, which is like arguing over Guadalcanal. I mean, if you'd gone to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and said, you know, we need a serious national debate about World War II, and we'd like to focus in on Guadalcanal. He'd have said, I'm fighting a global war. I'm going to beat Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Guadalcanal is a skirmish in the war. To describe Afghanistan without having a grand national strategy, without being able to describe honestly who our opponents are, without being able to lay out what the campaign is. And it doesn't have to be military. Both in our movie on Ronald Reagan and in a new movie we're making right now on Pope John Paul II visiting Poland in 1979, in both cases, we're describing one of the great strategies of history, which is overwhelmingly nonviolent. There's a priest who's beaten to death. There are a handful of people who are killed as demonstrators. And Poland unravels because the Polish people refuse to be conquered by the state. Czechoslovakia unravels. Romania unravels. Ukraine unravels. The Soviet Union disappears on Christmas Day 1991. Sort of an appropriate gift to the human race. But it wasn't fundamentally violent. The Berlin Wall comes down with no violence. But at least there was a grand strategy. You may remember Reagan is at a time when everybody in the elites believed the Soviet Union was powerful, it was inevitable, it was dangerous, you had to deal with them carefully, where Jimmy Carter was basically trying to appease them. Ronald Reagan is asked by a reporter, "What's your vision of the Cold War?" He says 4 words that change history. We win, they lose. Now, it startled people. They looked up, first of all, and it's fascinating to compare in some ways Carter and Obama, because it was a phrase Carter couldn't have used. First of all, it implied that there was a we. Second, it suggested that winning was an appropriate outcome. Whereas we're all us, and us wants to be together, and us should communicate, and if only us communicated better, we'd be happier with each other, and then we wouldn't have any problems, which is why he could never deal with the Iranians. The Iranians kept trying to send him a very clear signal. They knew exactly what they were saying. They were saying, "We hate you." And he'd say, "You know, I know we've had these difficulties. Maybe if we got together and chatted, we could find out what are you really saying?" And they'd say, "Well, let us try to really explain it to you more clearly. We really hate you." And he'd say, "Okay, I know you're calling us the Great Satan, and it's an interesting allegorical phrase, but what do you really mean by Great Satan? I mean, what do you," they were saying, "You're the center of all evil." Well, but when you say that, I mean, isn't there a meaningful way to build a bridge between us through mutual respect? And they'd say, "Yes. Why don't you convert, cease to be the United States, give up everything you're currently doing, and allow us to dominate, and we could probably get along okay." You say, "See the beginning of a real conversation." I'm not making any of this stuff up. You couldn't make this stuff up. So Reagan comes along. Now, and Reagan understood a couple things. First of all, as a politician, he understood, much like here at KU, the term "we win" would resonate. The average American can go, "Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we're we and we should win. I mean, obviously, and they're they and they should lose." I mean, you know, all of you understand this with every single sports event, right? There's a we and a they should lose. Why they came to visit and tried to win is silly. You want them to come and visit and lose. You have a much better party after the game if they lose. So why don't they cooperate, right? I mean, you know, this is the heart of the American model, okay? There's a second part to it. I did a speech at the American Enterprise Institute about on the 25th anniversary of the Evil Empire speech and the Strategic Defense Initiative speech. They're only 13 days apart. And it's fascinating to see it as an example of grand strategy and to compare it with the total absence. This is a bipartisan problem. So this is as much a Bush problem as it is an Obama problem. The total absence of grand strategic thinking in the last 8 years in both parties. Now, the speech I gave was designed to outline this in March of 2008. What's Reagan trying to accomplish and why? And these speeches are very dense. If you go back and read them, they are astonishingly filled with details. Because Reagan believed that he was actually not a great communicator. He was a great educator. He wanted people to understand the world he understood, and he wanted to share with them the facts he understood so that they would actually be prepared on their own to reach the same conclusion because they had the facts, not because they believed him. And so he uses this term, evil empire, which is an enormous shock. Here is a true story about great leadership. They knew they would have an enormous fight to get the State Department and the National Security Council to ever approve using the term evil empire. Because, I mean, it's pretty strong language. So they picked a speech to evangelical preachers in Florida, billed it as a political speech. The first two-thirds of the speech is really dull. When it got over to the National Security Council, one of the guys who wrote the speech told me the story. When it got to the National Security Council, they looked and said, well, political speech, Florida, evangelical ministers, not our problem. They gave it to an intern to read. The intern got bored halfway through the speech because it was really dull. They get to Florida. Reagan throws away the first two-thirds of the speech, which were not designed to be read. They were designed to get through the bureaucracy. And the speech he actually gives is just devastating. There's a great moment we have in our movie, Natan Sharansky, who at the time was a prisoner in the Gulag in Siberia. And Sharansky said, he later got to Israel and he became a minister in the Israeli government. But he says, Pravda got so upset by evil empire that they thought they had to answer it. And of course, to answer it, they had to explain he'd said it. He said, the morning they printed, Reagan says, evil empire, terrible speech, etc., warmonger Reagan, they said the morale of the guards collapsed because it was the first time a Western politician had told the truth about the Soviet empire. And the morale of the prisoners rose so dramatically that they were actually sending Morse code messages to the prisoners who were in solitary confinement so everybody's morale could go up because a Western leader had finally told the truth. That's how powerful it was. I'll give you one last example, because I want you to understand what it's like to have a leader who actually has a vision of success, is prepared to follow that vision, and what we don't have in national security today. Reagan, in 1967, as governor, went to Berlin. He had a throwaway line. That wall sure is ugly, they ought to tear it down. In 1987, he's going back to Berlin. Now he's won the presidency, he's been reelected in a landslide. They write a speech, which goes over to the State Department. It has one very famous sentence. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The State Department takes it out because they don't want to offend Gorbachev. Comes back to the White House. Reagan writes it back in. It goes back over to the State Department. They take it back out. Secretary George Shultz told me the story. He said, it goes back over to the White House. He gets a call. It's Reagan. He says, Georgie, you need to explain to your speech editor, I am the president. He is not. It stays in. Now, think about it. The nerve, the personal willpower to reach down into the bureaucracy and say, you know, I want the entire world to know that from we win, they lose, to evil empire, to tear down this wall, there's a continuity of pressure because I want them to morally break. People in 1980 thought he was crazy. At Christmas of 1991, the Soviet Union disappeared forever. We need in national security a grand national strategy that is honest about our opponents, clear about the threats, and outlines a coherent strategy of meeting those threats if we are going to be safe and our children and grandchildren are going to be safe and free. Those are the three questions. Who are we? How do we create jobs? And what do we do about protecting America and its allies in a world that's dangerous? Let me toss it open for questions and comments, and let's have some fun. As I understand, we have 3 roving mics, one of which relates to a room I can't see. Okay, so does anybody want to ask a question so a roving mic can approach you? Ah, here's a roving mic up here.
I didn't hear the word diplomacy in your presentation. How does that fit into your 3 ideas? That
Diplomacy?
Yes.
Well, diplomacy fits in many ways. Remember, this country was founded in part because brilliant diplomats like Adams and Franklin were able to convince the French to support us and able to convince the Dutch to help finance us and ultimately able to convince the Spanish to support us. So I think there are many ties in the American tradition that involve diplomacy. We have sustained through the Cold War an enormous worldwide diplomatic system, which we should continue to sustain. The great achievement over communism was in large part a diplomatic, psychological, economic victory. It wasn't a military victory. The goal of the military was to block the Soviets from attacking long enough for them to collapse. And then the goal of diplomacy was to surround them with opportunities. And if you look at the continuing pressure that we brought to bear, that was entirely diplomatic. In dealing with China, for example, we're going to have a much better diplomatic system so that our U.S. trade representative can be as clever and as aggressive as the Chinese are going to be at trying to exploit the various opportunities in the World Trade Organization. And if we want the Chinese to be engaged in a world trading system, we're going to have to learn how to be very, very good at negotiating, at least as good as they are. And so I think diplomacy is very important. I'm probably the only conservative in the country who has been actively saying we need a much bigger State Department budget, we need a much more professional Foreign Service, we need a substantially bigger capital investment in communications for the State Department, and we have to have a State Department which is capable of operating at a tempo and at a achievement level which is literally unattainable today. And that's not, I'm not blaming the State Department. This is an institution which is underfunded, undertrained, and under-equipped. And I think that diplomacy is a very significant part of this, and I think that's a great question. Okay?
Hi, Newt. I'd like to get your advice on a local issue, and that's the 3rd Congressional District. And as you may know, in 2002, that district was redesigned, which makes it very difficult for a Republican to win these days. And just wanted to get your input on how, any advice you have on that. Thank you.
Sure. Having helped create the Georgia Republican Party at a time when you didn't have to gerrymander anything because it was very difficult for Republicans everywhere, and so it's uphill, no matter where you were, it was uphill. My first advice is don't worry about gerrymandering. Worry about people. Bob McDonald had over 40 meetings with Asian Americans and over 100 meetings with Hispanic Americans, had a very active campaign with African Americans, campaigned in the suburbs of Northern Virginia in a way that no Republican in history had ever done. He carried the largest county in the state, which is a fairly liberal county. He carried all sorts of groups that no Republican ever carried, and he did so because he went out with a good message. I mean, you're going to have the 3rd District confronting next summer a nation that has too many unemployed people, a nation that isn't growing economically, a nation with a massive deficit, a nation faced with huge tax increases, and a nation that has a series of policies that will be relatively unpopular for 70 or 80% of the people of the district. And I think I'd relax. I would consciously try to build a very broad campaign. When I ran for the first time, and I was a Republican in Georgia running during Watergate, which was actually pretty irrational, and I was running against the dean of the delegation, who was the 4th ranking member of the Appropriations Committee, and people kept saying to me, "You can't win," and they were right. I got 48.5%. But one of the reasons I got 48.5%, which was enough to survive, one of the reasons I got 48.5% is we said from day one, we're going to concede to my opponent his immediate family. We're going to campaign everywhere. Well, to give you a real, true life example. We're out campaigning around Labor Day. I get this phone call. It turned out his next door neighbor had been in a bitter property dispute and hated him. And his neighbor said, "I want the largest yard sign you have. Because I want him to have to drive home past your name every night, and I want him to see it first thing when he leaves every morning." Now, I had a very inexpensive campaign that year. We raised about $85,000. I was a college teacher, no real money. Watergate was a really bad time to raise money as a Republican. But we had lots of college students helping. So a bunch of them went out back, and we got some plywood, and we painted this huge sign. I think it was 4 by 8 or something. And we took it over there and put it in. Now, I don't know that it got us many votes, but it raised the morale of our team so much. And the news media covered it because it was so strange. And I'm sure we carried the votes of that particular household, so we were splitting his home precinct. But I think if you forget all this baloney about base mobilization and figuring out cleverly where the votes are, if you decide you're going to compete for every possible vote in the 3rd District, the lesson of last night is, in New Jersey and in Virginia, you may be shocked. We had 4 Democratic congressional districts in Virginia where the Republican gubernatorial candidate got between 59 and 65%. Now, those 4 Democrats today had better be thinking really hard about whether or not they want to vote for Pelosi's gigantic socialized medicine bill. And I have a hunch that they're all 4 kind of thinking, you know, this may not be very clever. And I would just say there'll be plenty of opportunities in the next year for the 3rd District to decide to vote with Kansas or to vote with San Francisco. And at the end of that process, you might be shocked how many votes are available if you go after all of them and don't assume any of them are not available. Way in the back.
Yes, Speaker. Thank you for coming. You've given us much to think about. You've mentioned the need to tell truth. You've mentioned such ideas as you win or I win, you lose. I would just like to introduce myself as one who has lost. I am a 2008 KU grad, PhD. I am currently on food stamps. Doesn't look like I'll get a job anytime soon. I have no health insurance. I have no life insurance. I will never probably own my own home. You seem to be doing very well yourself. Doesn't look like I will, so it looks like I lose.
How old are you?
I'm 51.
Okay.
Okay?
All right. And you...
The GLP for many years has... Yes, I do. Has said that taxes need to be lower. I have a question for you, and that lowering taxes will cause jobs to be increased. Given the amount of money that you make, if your taxes were decreased 10%, say, or increased 10%, why could you not live on that much less when I have to live on less than $10,000 a year? And how many jobs could you create if you didn't have to pay that much more in taxes? This is a question that Senator Brownback refused to answer.
No, look, I'm happy to answer it. I'm just so startled by the defeatism in your voice. I recommend you read our novel and ask yourself until you've walked 9 miles in burlap in the middle of the winter and understand what it took to make America. I can't quite understand, if you're physically healthy and smart enough to get a PhD, why you're so defeated. Because you just painted a picture of such total despair that I worry about you as a person a lot more than I worry about politics. Because this is a country of enormous opportunity. Now, it may not be a country of enormous opportunity doing precisely what you want to do on terms you want to do it for. I was with an African American in Montgomery, Alabama yesterday, who is a major advisor to Coca-Cola and who owns 10 grocery stores. He began his career bagging groceries. And he hadn't heard all the people who said, how can you waste your life bagging groceries? So he actually showed up every day and bagged groceries. And he actually got paid for bagging groceries. And then he learned how to save. So he tried to spend slightly less than he earned, which is a radical concept for some Americans. And then he began to figure out that from bagging groceries, he was learning about the grocery business. And then he gradually got a better job at the grocery store because it turned out he was reliable and he showed up every day and he bagged groceries. And presently he knew everything he needed to know about running the grocery store. And one day, a big chain took over the grocery stores. And then they decided they didn't want 15 of them. And he said, by that stage he was management, and he said, I'll buy him. And he became the largest African-American owner of grocery stores in the United States. And it began with bagging groceries. And his message, we talked to 800 kids at George Washington Carver High School in Montgomery, which is one of the best high schools in America. And both of us had the same message, which actually my daughter and I wrote a book about called 5 Principles for a Successful Life. Dream big, work hard, learn every day, enjoy life, and be true to yourself. And I'd come back and say the same thing to you. I refuse to believe that it is impossible for you to find a job somewhere in America doing something which would give you an initial income which would enable you to get started. Now, this is a very hard time. Don't misunderstand me. This is a very hard time. But it's also a time when an amazing number of people are either going to create a job, which people are doing every day. I mean, if you look at the number of people who earn a living on eBay, it's eerie. I have to confess, this is not my world. I don't quite get it. But it is true that there are, I think there are as many people who sell on eBay regularly as there are who work at Walmart. And it's a different world. So all I would say to you is, you know, in terms of the first half of what you said, I reject the idea of any healthy American smart enough to get a PhD being defeated except by their own psyche. As to your second point, I don't quite understand it. I mean, we could easily make the following argument. Bill Gates is personally worth enough money that he could probably transfer his wealth to take care of most of the unemployed in California for 1 year. Now, how would we explain that to ourselves? That it wasn't right for him to have invented Microsoft, that it wasn't right for him to have invented Windows, that therefore this is not really his money, he didn't really earn it, the money belongs to the state, therefore why shouldn't we take it from him? Remember what I said earlier, either you're endowed by God, and originally they were going to put in private property rights rather than pursuit of happiness, or you're a creature of the state. Personally, I believe the optimum program for creating jobs in America would be very dramatic changes in tax policy. At American Solutions, we propose 5 fundamental changes in tax policy. First, a 2-year 50% reduction in Social Security and Medicare tax, including the employer's match, precisely to give every working American an increase in take-home pay and to enable every small business to have dramatically more liquidity so they could pay off debts and create new jobs. Second, we propose that if you really want to create jobs competing with China, you match the Chinese on capital gains. Theirs is 0. And if we had 0 capital gains, you would create so much new investment, you'd be amazed. Third, we would go to 100% expensing for small business investment. So any small business would bought new equipment so that its workers could be the best, the most productive, the most advanced technologically in the world, could write it off in 1 year. You would rapidly make American workers the most productive in the world and rebuild the entire business of creating new technology in the United States. Fourth, we would permanently abolish the death tax. And there's a very practical reason. It is fundamentally wrong to say to people, if you work all of your life, you save all of your life, you do the right things all of your life, the government will now take half of what you did, even though it was yours. I mean, most people understand instinctively it's morally wrong to ask somebody to go to the undertaker and the IRS the same week. It's just wrong. Which is why there's 80% support for permanently rebuilding the death tax, and I'm amazed that politicians in Washington don't understand this is the most popular single tax change. Finally, we think if you want American companies to compete in the world market, you have to recognize they are today the highest tax corporations in the world between federal and state income tax, and we would reduce federal tax on corporations to the Irish level, which is 12.5%, and you would have an explosion of American productivity. Now, notice what I'm describing. I'm describing an investment-led, work-led, small business-led, fundamental creation of private sector jobs with dramatic increases in investment in the United States, so we have the best equipment and the best technology in the world, which would also lead to the recentering in the United States of companies that create equipment and create technology. And that, in my judgment, would enable us to easily pull away from China and India and have the most productive workforce in the world and therefore the most prosperous. In that company, I will tell you flatly, I believe in what I just described, you would have so many job offers you'd be shocked at your range of choices 3 years from now. So, okay, where are our roving mics? Right here's a roving mic.
Hi, I was wondering, what would you say, how does America go about winning in the global conflict that you described that's been taking place over the last 30 years, and why has it not been done yet?
I think that we have not recognized the scale of our national security challenges for 3 reasons. First, we were the most successful national security system in history. If you look at our role from 1939 up through the last few years, there's no system in the world comparable to us, ever. I mean, we have global reach. We have an ability to create intelligence capabilities. We have an ability to project power. It's truly an extraordinary achievement, and we've invested a lot of time and money and talent, and a lot of very smart, hardworking people have been building this system now since the 1930s. So at one level, there's just a momentum of, you know, it isn't that bad a deal, why worry about it? Second, I think it's only in the last decade that the combination of very dramatic change in science and technology, combined with the rise of China, have begun to raise the possibility that we could be faced with enormous challenges. If you'd asked me in 1990, I would have said this was a far enough out problem that I wouldn't have made it a major national security concern. But by 2001, when the Hart-Rudman Commission, which I helped create with President Clinton, we'd already reached the conclusion that if we did not take very aggressive steps on science and math education, that we were in fact going to be we said it was the second greatest threat to the United States after a nuclear weapon going off in an American city. And that was in March of 2001. So we're now entering a zone that's different, that wasn't true 10 or 15 years ago. We're starting that conversation about how do we create the productivity base, the invention base, the creativity base that is necessary to remain the leading country in the world. The third one's different. Part of it's the academic world, part of it's the news media, part of it's the bureaucracies. Sometimes you're faced with a problem so hard that you don't want to think about it. I remember there was a New Yorker cartoon years ago that had somebody sitting at a desk that had an inbox, outbox, and too hard. And in a very real sense, I think, trying to put together the pieces was so frightening. The implication, I'll give you an example out of my personal experience. I was advising the national security apparatus in 2002. And I went by the CIA's counterterrorism center. And I was the only person to get the money in the 90s. If you read the 9/11 Commission report, they talk about the Gingrich plus-up. Because as Speaker of the House, I insisted that we strengthen the intelligence community against huge opposition from the Clinton administration. And so I had a certain cachet out there at the time. And you bring them $1 billion, they'll talk to you. And George Tenet had asked me to come out and look at some things. And so the Counterterrorism Center starts telling me what the problem is. And I said, okay, I said, slow down. I said, what do you think is the potential recruiting base? And they said, well, it's 3 to 5% of Islam. And I said, okay. And I did sort of a back of the envelope. I said, that would be like, 36 to 65 million. And they smiled, kind of like I was a really good third grader and I'd gotten the math question right. And they said, that's exactly right. And I said, all right, now tell me, what's the size of the operation you're going after? And they said, well, we think Al-Qaeda and its various associated groups is about 5,000. I said, okay, so you're telling me we have a grand strategic problem that could be in the 36 to 65 million range. and you're currently working full-time to design a solution to the 5,000 problem. They said, you got it. They said, this is exactly right. They said, we go down to the White House and we try to explain this to them. And they don't want to listen to us because it's too hard. So this is in the fall of 2002. So I got a piece of paper. And I wrote a really big circle, 36 to 65 million. And a really tiny circle, 5,000. And I went in to see Condi Rice and Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld, and I said, you know, this is the moment in Jaws where the police chief comes back and says, we need a bigger boat. You know, and in fairness to Bush once or twice tried to get there. I mean, if you read his second inaugural address, it's a remarkable inaugural address. But he couldn't, unlike Reagan, who knew how to manage the bureaucracy, he couldn't insist on the State Department and the national security apparatus accepting his interpretation. So if you go back and read his second inaugural is one of the most radical speeches of all the American inaugurals. Because he says, this is a gigantic problem, it is a mortal threat to us, and we're going to have to be for fundamental change. But if you're really serious about that, you need a really different strategy. And that's why 8 years into Afghanistan, we're no closer to winning. I mean, people should stop and say, this is not just about reviewing last month or reviewing McChrystal. This country has been engaged in Afghanistan for 8 years. We now have NATO engaged in Afghanistan, and we are clearly not winning. That should bother us. We should stop and say, wait, let's look at more. Let's pull it back some more. Let's understand better what's going on. And I think that is so hard in the context of Washington that it goes in the too hard file, which is why this is how it starts. You come to the right kind of places. You make the right kind of longer talks than you can make in Washington. You start setting a framework. This is what happened with the Nazis in the 30s. It's what happened with the communists in the 40s and 50s. It took a while for the country to talk to itself and say, yep, unfortunately that's true. I mean, the country didn't want to believe either one. But eventually, gradually, the country said, you know, it's 2 + 2 = 4. You show me a system that has terrorists getting arrested in Detroit, Denver, and New York in the last 6 weeks. I'll show you a problem. It ain't overseas. It isn't them. It's a fundamental challenge to our survival as a country. One or two more. One of the microphone people should come up close to the front because I'm afraid if one of these guys doesn't get a question, they're going to attack me. Way in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Newt, Dwight Eisenhower, Kansas's native son, proposed the idea of the interstate highway system. And he proposed it thinking it would make us safer in defense and stronger defense and enhance trade and commerce and that type of thing. And most Americans think it's a pretty good road that we all like to use and like to pay for. If today Eisenhower proposed something like that, one system run by the government, paid for and shared by all of us, he would be labeled a socialist and run out of the Republican Party. And I just would ask you, what's the difference between Dwight Eisenhower in the 50s proposing one interstate highway system for all of us and Dwight Eisenhower trying to propose a similar thing for health care in 2009?
Well, you raised a really good analogy, which I've used over and over again. First of all, I'm a huge fan of Eisenhower. I love going to the Presidential Library. I own his wartime papers, and I've studied him a lot over my lifetime. My dad was a big fan of Eisenhower's in his Army career. If you read At Ease, Stories I Tell My Friends, which was one of Eisenhower's memoirs, he talks about the fact that in 1919 he headed up the Army's cross-country truck convoy. First time they'd gone all the way across the country in trucks. And he talks about camping next to a stream in Nevada under the open sky and thinking to himself, because they were using dirt roads. I mean, this was really primitive stuff. And he's saying to himself, wouldn't it be great if we had a highway from coast to coast? And then he sees the Autobahn in Germany and the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which was the first Autobahn-style construction in the United States. And he gets to be president. And in 1955, and he's very intelligent how he did it, he proposes the National Defense Interstate Highway System. And he says, the purpose of this system is to enable us to evacuate the cities in the event of nuclear war. And by the way, if you watched it in Texas when there was a hurricane threat, they actually used it the way it was designed to be used. And they evacuated the whole Texas coast on the interstate. But, being a practical man, he said, however, in between nuclear wars, we ought to just go ahead and use it. Okay? Very Kansas kind of practical approach, right? I mean, if you got it sitting there being unused, why not get on and use it, right? But notice how they built it. First of all, the motorist who rode on it paid for it. So it wasn't deficit financing. It wasn't sleight of hand. And they didn't build it any faster than they could find the money. So it wasn't a 1995 page paper that's totally baloney. Second, they didn't build any of it with the federal government. The federal government established the standards, approved the plan, and delegated the whole thing to the states, and it's essentially almost a 10th Amendment process. And the states then didn't build, I don't know of a single state that built its own highways. The states then contracted with private contractors who had to actually earn a living by actually building a road in order to get paid. It was a very radical concept. You had to actually do the job. Now, I would suggest to you, you take the recent $787 billion stimulus plan, and I'll bet you there's not more than $60 billion in there that Eisenhower would have thought made any sense. So, if you're... I argued for years, publicly, in a book called Saving Lives and Saving Money that we wrote in December of 2002 in a variety of speeches. I used the same example, and I said the federal government should find a way to finance an electronic health record system because, I didn't say they should build it, they should finance it, because if we get hit with a nuclear event, a really big earthquake in California, or a pandemic, the scale of risk to our lives is so great, we need the most modern possible health information technology to ensure that everybody in this very mobile society is able to figure out what they need. And if you look at what happened in New Orleans after Katrina, if you were in an electronic system, you didn't miss a pace. But if you weren't in an electronic system and your doctor's office was flooded, you ended up at MD Anderson needing chemotherapy with no knowledge of where you were in your program. And I know because I talked to the people at MD Anderson who handled 400 cases. Now, so I was prepared to take an Eisenhower position, which is in a limited way. I am for the federal government financing investments. I am against the federal government trying to do very much as opposed to pay for it, and I'm against the federal government controlling things because I think those are very bad policies. And I draw a very sharp distinction between an investment, which by the way means it has to repay itself, and giving money to politicians so they can avoid making tough decisions, which is what most of the stimulus was, a politician's bailout bill to allow state and local governments to avoid making hard decisions, and it was a terrible idea. And in January, all of them are going to be in deeper debt with bigger budgets and harder choices because they didn't make the choices this year. Okay? Where are we at here? I got all these people up front. I can't get a microphone up here. See, I told you it's really important. I mean, these guys are about to just charge the podium.
Thank you for this opportunity, sir. I've been enlisted in the Navy for nearly 10 years now, and I absolutely love fighting for this country. It's an amazing opportunity. But please. I'm hoping that my question is on theme with your speech tonight, and that's how much damage. I'm kind of new to the political thing, and it's been what's on TV that's kind of been awoken me. Sorry, but I'm worried about the direction of the country, and I want to know how much damage has already been done and how much damage could be done with the current administration, that even if a conservative Republican were to get elected in 2012, what could not be undone? What am I fighting for? And sorry to phrase my question, I want to know that the things that I'm fighting for aren't going to be changed.
Well, first of all, let me thank you for serving your country. I think it's very important, and I'm very grateful that you're here tonight. And my dad spent 27 years in the Army, so I really appreciate what you've put up with and what you've sacrificed and what you're doing. Second, I want to offer you a message of hope. Our Constitution is the most extraordinary Constitution in the world. If you get a big enough majority in the Congress and you get a president who's in agreement, it is astonishing what you can get done. If you go back and look at how bad things were in December of 1980 and how rapidly Reagan began to turn them around, it was astonishing. If you look at historically my favorite example is the Jeffersonians. The Jefferson organizes the first modern political party, the Democratic Republican Party, which becomes the Democratic Party. And in 1800 he wins one of the first great election in which an opposition party actually takes power away from the incumbent party, and they transfer the power peacefully. But we had a very slow process back then, and you didn't get sworn in until March. So the Federalists, who've now been wiped out, decide that they are going to create a whole set of new judges and a whole set of other offices, and before they get replaced in March, they're going to try to do everything they can to create a Federalist government that Jefferson won't be able to change. Now, Jefferson won an enormous victory with huge margins in the House and Senate. So they created 18 federal judges. By the way, to show you a sense of scale, the total number of federal judges before the election was 17. So they are, after the election, after they're defeated, they are more than doubling the number of federal judges. All of them are going to be Federalists. They're going to be appointed for life. There's nothing you can do about it. And so the Jeffersonians go crazy. Now, trying to impeach the judges would have been very difficult and very painful, although they did, the only real successful impeachment of a U.S. Supreme Court justice was under Jefferson, where they did actually impeach one. But the Jeffersonians decide they're not going to go that route. So they pass the Judicial Reform Act of 1802, which abolishes all 18 judgeships. They say, we're not going to impeach you, it's just there is no court. And you're not going to get paid. And you have no clerks, and you're not going to hear any cases. Well, these judges, of course, are all jumping up and down saying this is a violation of the Constitution because a judgeship is a lifetime appointment. So they go over to file suit at one of the remaining 17 courts. Now, you are a Federalist judge who has a lifetime appointment in a court that still exists. And your friends come up and say to you, I have this great idea. How about you find that the Congress and the President were unconstitutional in eliminating my job? And the remaining Federalist judges said, you know, we think if we agreed with you, they would abolish our court. And so they couldn't get anybody to hear the case. They just disappeared. Now, I only give you that as an example. If you had said in 1993, let's really reform welfare, everybody would have told you that's not practical, you can't get it done, etc. Because Reagan raised the question in 1966, because a whole generation of conservative intellectuals had worked on the question, because Governors Thompson and Leavitt and Engler had actually developed state-level reforms, we were actually intellectually ready. So when we won in 94, we didn't go in and say, oh, let's marginally change welfare. We said we're going to take a welfare program that's redistributionist and replace it with a work-study program. And it worked so well that 65% of the people in welfare either went to work or went to school. And this is what I said Jan helped us design. Nobody thought that was possible in 93. They said you can't change government that much. Well, it turns out if you pass it and the president signs it and the court doesn't say it's unconstitutional, you got it done. Now, the truth is, I taught a course at University of Georgia Law School this spring on this, I believe if the court says it's unconstitutional and the Congress and the president both disagree, they in fact can override the court. The court is not the there is not a Supreme Court in that sense. And the Federalist Papers are very clear about this, that there's no such thing as one branch dictating to the other two branches. And there are 100 ways you could deal with the court if the Congress and the President agreed. So your ability as a citizen to try to figure out the next phase of where we're going is 100%. This is the most, within the rules of the Constitution, this is the most wide open society in the history of the human race, and I do not believe they can do enough damage to fundamentally change that. And I believe if Jimmy Carter couldn't do enough damage, it's very unlikely these guys will. Okay, yes.
Honored to meet you, Mr. Gingrich. My question is, given the premise of your speech tonight and the both international and domestic crisis we may be in, and also the almost historic lack of leadership in the Republican Party right now, can you go on operating on the sidelines? Or will you step into that vacuum and become a leader again in the Republican Party?
Well, let me divide that into two parts. I don't think there's a vacuum. I think we're having the natural process. Remember, Reagan doesn't become the leader of the Republican Party until May of 1980. When you don't have a president, and you don't have a Senate Majority Leader, and you don't have a Speaker, you don't have a national leader. You ought to just relax and go, hi, we're in a period where we don't have a national leader. So lots of people get to audition. You know, so Tim Pawlenty's out auditioning, and Mitt Romney's out auditioning, and Huckabee is out auditioning, and Palin's about to be on Oprah and have a book tour and audition. It's fine. I mean, I'm not particularly anxiety-ridden. We will eventually have a nominee. It will happen. I mean, we'll have an election in 12. It'll happen, you know. But in the interim, let's look at what is happening. I think Michael Steele is going to turn out to be a very good national chairman. He's learning. He's new. But I'll guarantee you, in the age of Obama, I would much rather have Michael Steele on television and Michael Steele on radio. He was campaigning in New Jersey, and he was doing a good job. He was campaigning in Virginia. They raised more money in August than any RNC in history. Now, I will confess that Pelosi and Obama were extraordinarily effective as the finance co-chairs for the RNC in August. But nonetheless, they literally raised more money. So I start with the fact Michael Steele is going to turn out to be, I think, a very solid player. The fact is, last night, you got two great new national Republicans. You got Chris Christie, who is governor of New Jersey, which is a hard thing to be. And this is a guy, remember, who has indicted 138 people, convicted 120, and the other 18 haven't gone to trial yet. He hasn't lost a single case. You know, I mean, this guy's going to, it's going to be fascinating to watch him in New Jersey because he's tough. And you've got in Bob McDonnell a superstar. This is a guy, when you get 59% in Virginia, and you're sweeping the suburbs, and you are picking up, they were printing campaign signs in 4 languages. And they had groups all over the state who were actively for McDonnell. And this is a guy that the Washington Post did everything it could to smear and destroy. And the state just said no. They weren't going to listen to it. And in fact, he carried in, I think they picked up 6 seats in the state legislature. They picked up, the lieutenant governor won big, the attorney general won big. So as far as I'm concerned, look at Bob McDonnell and say to yourself, no, there's a guy who's a real leader. Mitch Daniel is a great governor of Indiana. He got 40% of the African-American vote in Indianapolis with Obama on the other ticket. He has created jobs, he's balanced the budget, he's been innovative, he's into education reform, he's into health reform. Bobby Jindal is virtually a genius. I mean, he will eventually be one of the great national leaders in this country. He's doing an amazing job in Louisiana. So I started looking around the country, I think, why is it that people are anxiety-ridden? I think they're anxiety-ridden because it's the nature of the national news media to be anxiety-ridden. I had this one person, a reporter interviewed me this afternoon, and she said, don't you feel really terrible about New York 23? I said, well, actually, I feel really great about Virginia and New Jersey. And she said, yeah, but don't you really worry about the collapse of the party in New York 23? I said, well, I think when you get 59%, you can think there's a future. And she said, yeah, but, I mean, she knew what her story was going to be. The other week, there was one of the magazines had a cover story, and it had Rush, and it had Glenn Beck, and I think it had Palin. It said the face of the Republican Party. And some reporter comes running up because that's exactly the fight they want. They'd like nothing better than for us to waste our time fighting among ourselves. And I said, well, actually, I predict that on the day after the election, the face of the Republican Party is going to be Chris Christie, who is actually going to win a governorship and run a state, and it's going to be Bob McDonnell, who's going to win a governorship and run a state. And I actually think those are bigger jobs than talk radio hosts. Now, that was such a shocking thing to say that the reporter who asked me that thought, well, I don't know how to write that story. That'd be weird. I mean, you'd have to be writing about governors. I mean, I want to write about Fox News. So I think you just have to relax, and I'm actually pretty confident that the Republican Party will be doing just fine. And frankly, if Obama turns out to be like Carter and can't learn, just remember, without Carter, you might not have gotten Reagan. Without Reagan, the Soviet Union would still be here. So you owe Jimmy Carter a debt of gratitude for creating the environment. Okay, what? Okay, let's see. Which was, that stuff. Oh, yeah. Look, I'm going to stay very busy at American Solutions developing a new generation of ideas and solutions. I'm going to be very busy at the Center for Health Transformation. And then in February of 2011, we're going to contact our many friends. And if there's a sufficiently big desire for me to be a leader, I'll probably try to be a leader. If there's not, I will relax and not go. So where? Okay, go for it.
And this might be kind of odd after that last question, but as a independent of my age, a lot of the things that you were talking about seem, in my mind, as a problem with both parties. So I was wondering if you could talk about the two-party system that we have, and also I think George Washington you talked about him. He was kind of not a fan of the two-party system. So.
No, Washington actually didn't like parties in general and thought factions were dangerous. The question is whether or not they're avoidable, and my guess is they're not in a free society. Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, which are the most elegant campaign brochures ever written. Remember, the Federalist Papers are written as campaign brochures to sell the Constitution. I mean, it's just that they're really amazingly well written. And Madison says, look, factions are inevitable. Washington didn't like him because Washington had been a commanding general. And commanding generals, as a general rule, are not big on factions. But part of the genius of the American system was we weren't created by one person. We were created by an extraordinary number of very, very dedicated and serious people, many of whom had different views and argued constantly. And so Madison writes that anything which could control factions, this is, by the way, my number one critique about campaign finance law, anything which can control factions runs the risk of dictatorship. And therefore, you have to accept that there will be factions, and the real answer is to have other factions balance them off so that it's in the competition and conflict of factions that you are protected. And now this is straight out of the Federalist Papers, and he begins by saying, if men were angels, we wouldn't need to worry about being governed. But since they're not angels, what is it we're going to do about those to whom we loan power? It's a very, very thoughtful and sophisticated argument. Now, I am a big fan of the two-party system. It has given us, for 225 years, enormous underlying stability. It forces us to fight out all sorts of things. It just drives purists crazy. Because a governing majority in the United States is about 60%. I mean, if you really want a stable governing majority in the FDR tradition, you have to be at about 60%. 60% of 300 million is 180 million people. Now, just think to yourself. If you were inviting 180 million people to the family reunion, do you realize how many truly weird people would be showing up? And so if you're serious about governing the country, and this is my number one argument with many of my ideological friends, if all you want to do is protest and be angry, that's fine. But by the way, Pelosi and Obama will stay in power. So if you want to go to the next stage and try to figure out, so how are we going to win enough seats? And I've done this twice. I did it with Reagan in 80, and we did it in 94 with the contract. And then with Joe Gaylord who's over here, we also did it in 96 when we became the first re-elected House majority since 1928. Okay. Well, it's a fundamentally different requirement. Because now you got to figure out, how am I going to keep the whole family at the reunion, preferably by keeping the ones who like to fight at opposite sides of the picnic. Because if I get them together, they're just going to kill each other. And you got to consciously lead and coordinate that. Now, it makes it messy and it makes it frustrating. But it is a system which has enabled us to remain free, to become the most powerful nation in history, the most successful nation at integrating people from different cultures, and the most prosperous nation. That's a fair amount. And I don't know that I want to give that up for some other system that doesn't work very well. So I'm told, by Bill, I'm allowed to have one last question. So, way in the back, from all the unknown people in the other room.
I lived in Germany for a number of years, and while I was there, I developed this idea that America has certain policies and politics to make sure that fuel, food, etc., commodities are affordable that we buy from other countries. But they're also affordable for everybody else. For example, Europe, which didn't invest any money into making it affordable, so they have all this extra money they can spend on government, which allows them to create this socialist world that gets repackaged and sold to us. And in a roundabout way, us doing what for us is in our best interest comes back to haunt us by having socialism dropped on our doorstep as a perfect utopian model. How do you avoid that? How do you avoid doing something for yourself and then having it come back to bite you?
Well, first of all, I mean, that's a very interesting analytical base, which is not totally inaccurate. I think there's a good bit to what you just said. But let me draw the distinction for a second. We came out of the Second World War with 50% of the world's economy because everybody else had been bombed. I mean, I used to tell people the number one reason we didn't have to worry about being competitive in 1946 is we had bombed Toyota and Mercedes, and it's not a strategy you can use randomly. I mean, it's not, you got to get over it and figure out how are you going to deal with them while they still have their factories. And it's partly funny, but it's partly real. So when you look at the great generation, which fought World War I, studied and prepared for World War II, fought World War II, and then created the framework of the Cold War. These are all the same people. They were operating from a base of such enormous relative wealth that we could be stunningly generous, and we were. The Marshall Plan is one of the most generous things in human history. And it was fine. It's exactly the right thing to do at that moment. Now we're in a different world. Now, actually, I think there are two parts to what you said. And I'll close this, but let me go back to being a professor for a minute. I really urge all of you, if you get a chance, to read a book by Claire Berlinski. Her last name is The City of Berlin, S.K.I. Claire Berlinski is an American novelist. She lives in Istanbul. But she was a graduate student at Cambridge when Thatcher was Prime Minister. The book is called Why Margaret Thatcher Matters. What she says is that Thatcher, when she became leader of the opposition in 1975, came to the conclusion that socialism as an ideology and the coal miner union power as a sheer brute power system were destroying Great Britain. And that if Great Britain was going to survive, you had to be prepared to break the whole concept of socialism as an ideology. And you had to be prepared to break the organizational power of the coal miners. And that this would be the equivalent of a cultural war, a genuine war. So that according to Berlinski's model, by 1979, Thatcher had become a warrior. And that the normal politician of 1975 had thought so deeply and so profoundly about what would be needed that she was prepared to take the beating that would be involved. There is no doubt that she fundamentally changed Great Britain. And it is a different country today than it was in 1979. And it's a much more productive country, a much wealthier country. The place to see this is a second book by Sarkozy called Testimony. Before he ran for president of France, Sarkozy decided he would be an agent of real change. In fact, I talk about this in my book, Real Change. And so he wrote this book, and he says in the book, before Thatcher, the French economy was 25% bigger than the British economy. Today, this would be 2007, the British economy is 10% bigger than the French economy. And 400,000 French men and women work in London because you can earn a better living than you can in Paris. And he says to retirees, if you want us to be able to pay your pension and you want us to be able to sustain your health care, you had better favor economic growth. Because if we don't grow economically, we're not going to have any money. It's a very profound book. It's a startling book for a French politician to have written. Now, I share that with you because I believe the three questions I ask you are as profound as Thatcher. If you believe, as I do, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that every one of us has an obligation to be responsible citizens, to pursue happiness, to be honest about 2 + 2 = 4, to insist on policies that are transparent, accountable, and honest. You're in a different world than if you think politics is about a secular socialist bureaucracy taking care of us while the country decays. I think these are fundamentally antithetical. If you believe, as I do, that the key to China and India is not to hide, the key to China and India is to figure out what we need to do to get our act together so our children and grandchildren are the best educated, best prepared, have the best equipment, and are the most entrepreneurial in the world, then you're in a very different place than if you think the real job we have is to avoid reality, prop up decaying institutions, and pay off the bureaucracies even if they don't deliver. And finally, if you think there are real threats to us, threats that could fundamentally change our civilization by the pain they would cause, then we have to design a grand national strategy. We have to have an honest national conversation. And we as a free people have to make the commitments that we will sustain so that our children and grandchildren are free and our allies are safe. I think that's where we are. I'm an optimist. We've done this now for over 200 years. We're actually pretty darn good at it. And I suspect a generation from now we'll be doing just fine. Thank you all very, very much.